flyer that I just have one copy, but I'll give it to the most aggressive person who gets to me first. Anything? Yeah.
I'm just curious why, if naturally the psilocybin mushrooms grow out of cow dung, why when you do it in a laboratory kind of situation is it so important that you do it under sterile conditions?
Well, because it's very selective in nature. It does grow out of cow dung, but in the case of Stropharia cubensis, it requires the dung of Cebu cattle, the white, humpbacked, tropical cow. I've seen pastures in Colombia where there were Cebu on one side of the fence and the pasture was full of mushrooms, and there was a mixed herd, 50% Cebu on the other side of the fence, and the mushroom just wouldn't occur. When you grow mushrooms in artificial culture, the strategy, all life requires the 8 essential amino acids. We all learn this in nutrition class. Well, so what you grow these mushrooms on is rye. And the endosperm of the rye, when it bursts from cooking, all 8 amino acids are available in the endosperm. So theoretically, you could grow almost anything on that medium. So that's why the only way you could grow Stropharia cubensis on manure that was not Cebu manure is if you very carefully composted it and neutralized it and that sort of thing. Mushroom growers know how to do this kind of thing, but it's definitely an art. Mushroom growing, I just can't say enough good things about it. It's alchemy. And this organism is an absolute workhorse. It will take 112 grams of rye and turn it into 12 dried grams of mushrooms. That's a 10% conversion rate. We used to say that a $17 100-pound sack of rye was worth $25,000 when put through this process. I loved it when people would come up to me at my talks and say, I just want to thank you for writing the mushroom book. You kept a family off welfare for 10 years. And in fact, we're moving to the south of France. Anything else on this? Yeah.
As we go deeper and deeper into the psychedelic experience, it seems that, well, I personally become radically aware of the contrast. Like, when intoxicated, you go into the ecstasy and you release your ego and allow yourself to fully open. But then, on coming down, you like slam back into this Western civilization, ego and the whole reality of it. And I'm wondering how you, for so many years, going deeper and deeper in, how you managed to integrate yourself.
Well, I think the answer is not very well. I'm very fortunate to have the career you see me hard at work at here, because what else could I possibly do? Well, I remember one time I was in the psych library at the University of California looking up something about drugs, and I pulled a book off the shelf, just at random, and opened it up, and it was describing process schizophrenia. And it said, the victim of this particular syndrome lives in a twilight world of self-generated fantasy and occupies a marginal position in society, usually holding down odd jobs and moving from... So this is it. Now I understand. So... my father used to tell me, he said, you'd rather change the world than change yourself. And I guess that's what happened. I've managed to make this marginality something that I can actually make a living out of. I think it's hard. If you take psychedelics and are completely without community, you you sort of think you're nuts. One of the things that's so important about a get-together like this and like last night is that the psychedelic community sees itself. I mean, they've ripped off our fashions, our hair length, our speech styles, everything else. You can't really tell freaks from everybody else. But when the community self-selects to come here, someone like myself or Andy Wilde or Tim Leary or whatever, you should look around and see who's here, because these are the people that can be the basis of a community. Also, probably whatever you're looking for, someone in this room has. And it's just sort of a kind of social scavenger hunt to figure that out, you know. But it's really important to build community. If, you know, there's this cliche, one person with a mad idea is deluded. 2 people with a mad idea is a folle à deux. 3 people with a mad idea is a cult. And 4 people with a mad idea is a religion. And 5 people with a mad idea, that's reality. So it's all about building a common language so that we can talk about it and support each other as we come and go from it. Otherwise, it will always remain private, marginalized, and socially inconsequential, I think.
I mean, how fortunate it is that, like, in the more primitive cultures, in the more indigenous cultures, where they have a shaman there, not only voyage the group through the hyperspace, but then upon going back to everyday life, they're far more integrated with nature and living that integration of non-barriers.
Well, and everyday life for them is being embedded in a climaxed tropical forest or something like that. Yes. No, it's very hard to make sense of, like, taking psychedelics in Manhattan or something and then coming down to fit yourself into that world. The cognitive dissonance that we feel between the psychedelic state and the lives we have to lead is a measure of how far we've fallen from any kind of lifestyle that supports self-exploration of the body and the mind. I mean, we have literally become cogs in a machine. When I go to LA and fly over the suburbs and look down, it looks to me like a magnification of an electronic chip. You know, it is in fact simply a fractal resonance of the electronic chips that are in the toasters, vacuum cleaners, and televisions in those houses. And as you look down, you realize as long as the Reader's Digest stays subscribed to, as long as the people who live in those houses climb in their Japanese cars and go to their jobs every day, the system works. But the amount of humanness in that system, the amount of passion, the amount of dreaming and romantic hope is zero, you know. I mean, people's idea of a golden dream is a better BMW. And this creates, you know, toxic, low awareness lives. And then people wonder why they're depressed and have ulcers and their children don't respect them and so forth and so on.
So sad.
Well, we have allowed institutions to rule our lives. And institutions are not necessarily servants of the human agenda. I mean, I think I said to somebody during the break last night, I quoted Lenin, who said, when it comes time to hang the capitalists, they will sell us new rope. I feel like, you know, we're just willing to deal the planet until there's no planet left to stand on. There seems to be no awareness of limits or the impact that we're having on the planet. We've invented a sin that didn't even exist until the 20th century, which is the sin of robbing your own children of their future. I mean, no society in history has ever been so perverse that it would actually loot its children's future. I mean, that's what society is for, is to secure the children's future. But in the way we destroy land and pile up debt, we're handing this all on to the unborn. And it's an incredibly infantile and self-indulgent and egocentric approach to the phenomenon of life. I'm sure you've all seen these bumper stickers that say, "Live simply, that others may simply live." And, you know, this is an idea worth holding. Somehow we have to reverse our, what I call consumer object fetishism. That we are fetishistically obsessed with stuff. And this is wrecking the planet. When we were nomads in Africa, there was no material culture at all. People felt inner wealth was your existential validity, who you were, the power of your songs, the power of your speech, your hunting prowess, your sexual prowess, your magical prowess. It was who you were, not what you had. Nobody had anything because everybody was on the move. They never slept in the same place twice. The invention of agriculture was a strategy for the production of food that was monstrously successful. I mean, you can imagine when these river valleys like the Tigris, Euphrates, and the Nile, when they had never been farmed, when they had millions of years of topsoil accumulated there, the response to early agricultural efforts was a tremendous surplus. Well, you can't carry it with you. So consequently, you stay with it. And then you build a tower to put it in. The oldest and most complex structure known to exist was the grain tower at Jericho. And it was for holding grain, and it was also constructed so that you could climb to the top and drop large, heavy objects on people outside, people who were obviously trying to get at the grain. The invention of agriculture created haves and have-nots. It created economy, because suddenly you had more food than you could eat at any one time, so the concept of trade arises. It creates urbanization. It creates specialized work patterns. And you can just see how we are the inheritors of all of these new institutions, the institutions that arose in the Neolithic, urbanism, agriculture, job specialization, gender specialization, so forth and so on. This set us on the downhill path to the present circumstance in the absence of psychedelics. Yeah.
There's in Dialogues at the Edge of the West, you and Rupert talk about resacralization, and one of the aspects of that is the visiting of the sacred sites and the taking of the hallucinogens in those kind of contexts. Can you talk a little bit about this? I mean, have you got any feedback in terms of experiences at the sites under influence?
Well, as you may or may not know, Rupert Sheldrake is the great developer and purveyor of the theory of morphogenetic fields. And that's the idea that the past actually has a presence in the now, that things happen easier if they've happened before. That's not a scientific principle at all. In fact, from the scientific point of view, that's nonsense. But if it's true, then a ruin where people lived for thousands and thousands of years with a certain lifestyle should have a kind of ambient field that you can tap into. And I think this is true. I don't exactly understand the mechanism, but it's certainly true that when you take mushrooms at, say, Palenque in Chiapas or Monte Alban or someplace like that, you see the motifs of the civilizations that inhabited that spot. Taking psilocybin at Borobudur in Java is a completely different experience than taking it at Tikal, for example. It is as though the past lingers in places. The model that I want to communicate to you about psychedelics that I think is most fits the facts, I mentioned this a little bit last night, is a mathematical model that consciousness, well, here's a metaphor. Some of you may be physical chemists, and you know how sulfur has two melting points. I mean, if you have yellow sulfur and you heat it, it will liquefy. But if you keep heating it, strangely enough, it will re-solidify. And if you continue heating it, it will melt again at a higher temperature. It has two melting points. So the way I think of consciousness is it is something which takes the shape of the vessel which contains it, the way water, when poured into a pitcher or a glass, takes the shape of the container. And we, for reasons discussable but not entirely clear, are born into a three-dimensional matrix with a temporal dimension. And consciousness, the process of becoming a child and an adult out of infanthood, is the process of consciousness taking the shape of the container of three-dimensional space, learning to coordinate eye-hand movement, so forth and so on. When we take psychedelics, the three-dimensional boundaries are dissolved. This is the equivalent of liquefying the crystal of consciousness, and then it recrystallizes in a different geometry, a higher geometry. I mean, let's analyze for a moment the classical claims made by shamanism as practiced by Aboriginal peoples. They say the shaman can cure, the shaman can predict the weather, the shaman knows where the game has gone, and the shaman can settle social hassles that have to do with who stole the chicken or who's sleeping with who that they shouldn't be, this kind of stuff that goes on in a human community. Well, now let's analyze those abilities. The shaman can cure. If you could see the future and you were a doctor, you would never take on a patient that you knew was going to die, because it would be destructive of your reputation. If you could see the future, predicting weather is no problem. You just look at next week and there it is. If you could see the future, saying where the game had gone would be no problem, because you could see it. And if you could see the future, if you had a hyperdimensional perception, then questions like who stole the chicken or who is sleeping out on who would be perfectly transparent. So I think consciousness has a hyperdimensional modality that we downloaded into the somatic dimension of the body as a survival strategy. The primary purpose of the mind in three-dimensional space is a threat detector. You know, it anticipates problems, approaching saber-toothed tigers, large holes in the ground, falling branches. The mind is a threat detector, and it moves the physical body out of harm's way. That's an evolutionary and practical adaptation of consciousness. What consciousness is in and of and for itself is very hard to say exactly. So, hanging out with Rupert Sheldrake and the other author of Trialogues at the Edge of the West, who is Ralph Abraham, a brilliant mathematician, research mathematician, it seems to me that the best model of what psychedelics do is they actually raise the dimensionality of the experience of mind so that you actually look down on time. You see the past. You see the future in a way that is very hard to put into English, because English is a language that has evolved inside the constraints of three-dimensional space and time. That's why it's so hard to create a language that can contain these things. But I take seriously the perceptions of shamanism. They are not in any sense of the word delusions. That's why I called my book True Hallucinations. Hallucinations are a form of perception that is as true as ordinary vision. It's simply not about ordinary space and time. It's about hyperspace and hypertime. This is why you've probably noticed in me, and I certainly notice it in other psychedelic people, an extraordinary awareness of large scales of space and time. It's no problem for me to shift 10,000 years in the past or 100 million years in the past. At any point in any conversation, I can see the whole thing. I'm also aware of the spatial size of the universe and how it's put together. This is a psychedelic perception acquired over years and years of doing it. I always think of Giordano Bruno, the Franciscan heretic of the 15th century, 15th, 14th, 16th century, who was burned at the stake because he realized that the universe is infinite. Giordano Bruno said, the stars that we see at night are suns hung like lamps to the uttermost limit of infinity. Nobody had ever said that before. They were all living in an Aristotelian universe of concentric shells. He broke through that by simply opening his eyes and looking at the night sky. And then a primary perception about nature came to him. And nature is the ground of the psychedelic experience, because when you look at reality on a scale of 100 million years, most of it is nature. I mean, the artifacts of human civilization arise very late in the context of being. Yeah.
Can you talk about some of the inhabitants of these other dimensions that you've met and talked to? I noticed that you said that you didn't think there was moral perfection in these realms. What are the intentions of these beings towards humans?
Well, wild horses couldn't dissuade me from talking about this. This is, the question was, what about the entities that are encountered in these dimensions? And I guess it carries us to the core issue, because, if I tell you that there is a substance, a plant, or a drug that allows you to access childhood memories, or that allows you to more deeply appreciate art and music, or that allows you to be a kinder, gentler human being, I don't think this is exciting, but it doesn't strain credibility. But if I say to you that there is a drug that will convey you into a domain inhabited by glossolalia jabbering elf machines that are producing strange technologies with your voice and attempting to direct human destiny, that's a little more confounding. We've moved well beyond the Freudian or Jungian map of the unconscious with that. That was what really set me on this path. I had taken LSD before I smoked DMT, and I was able to hold it within the model provided by Freud and Jung and Huxley and ordinary literatures of mystical experience. But when you smoke DMT, it seems to carry you into a data field that is well beyond the ordinary or classical mystical domains, because the first thing most people notice about the DMT flash is that it's filled with organized intelligence. You see entities, and they are not material, but they are full of affection and interest in humanity, and they are attempting to communicate something. I don't know how many of you have actually smoked DMT, but or heard me describe what happens when I do it. But it is the most extraordinary experience that a human being can have this side of the yawning grave. I mean, there's no doubt about it. It's, you know, the onset is very rapid, like 15 to 20 seconds. And first there's a kind of a swirling mandalic form, usually orange or yellow, that we've come to call the chrysanthemum, simply because that's what it looks like. It looks like a chrysanthemum. And then, and as you're looking at that, what's happening at the synaptic level is these DMT molecules, which have a greater affinity for the serotonin receptor than serotonin itself. By the tens of millions, these molecules are elbowing serotonin aside and fitting themselves into the lock of the receptor and turning the key. And there is this high-pitched, and then a sense of a membrane breaking or ripping or something. There's a sound like a bread wrapper being crumpled. Which a friend of mine said, oh yes, that's your radio intellecty leaving the anterior fontanelle at the top of your head. Well, maybe. It's certainly something dramatic is going on. And then you are propelled into a kind of tunnel, a kind of disystolic, fluctuating thing. And there's a lot of sucking and popping sounds, a kind of a... You're being pumped through, and you see the ceiling come down and meet the floor of this space, and then where they meet, they like adhere to each other, and then when it pulls back, there's another space, and you tumble into it. And then this sucking, pushing, propelling thing goes on for maybe 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and then I find myself in what I call the elf hive, a very, very bizarre environment that many people have experienced that has a lot of consistency about it. It does not seem like a state of mind. It does not seem like a production of your imagination. It seems like a place. I mean, every preceptor in your body is telling you, you are somewhere. This is not an experience happening in your mind. You are somewhere. The argument for that is that as you search yourself, you discover that you haven't changed. You're who you were before you smoked the DMT. The problem is the world has been completely replaced by something previously inconceivable and totally unimaginable. No artist, no culture, no civilization produced art or images or literature or poetry which even hinted at this place. This is not the realm of the Jungian archetypes. This is some other domain. And what it is it's a room, a domed space, light indirectly lit. You can't tell where the light is coming from, but there seems to be no point source. And you know, in some intuitive and translogical sense, you know that you're far underground. You know that a massive amount of weight is above this space, even though it's spacious. And the walls of this domed room are crawling with geometric hallucinations. But none of this is what seizes your attention immediately. What seizes your attention is that this place is filled with entities, with the famous self-transforming machine elves of hyperspace. These things which look like jeweled, self-dribbling basketballs. These self-propelled, autonomous complexes of light and faceted color that come bounding up to you and then hesitate and then jump into your body and jump out or crawl all over you. And you have to understand, this is 30 seconds deep into this experience. You were with your ratty friends somewhere, using drugs with someone, and now that's all gone. And you're in this place. And the usual, I mean, I react to it like, you know, and I'm like, oh, God. You know, yes, breathing, yes, yes, pulse, yes, almost, breathe, breathe, breathe. And these things are saying, you know, they're dancing around in front of you and they're saying, do not abandon yourself to amazement. Do not give in to wonder, which is an almost impossible piece of advice because you're going through all kinds of changes. First of all, the question, this couldn't happen unless I was dead. You just say, you know, this is too far out. There's no, you don't go to this place and come back. So you're dealing with that, you know, am I all right? And after about 15, 20 seconds, you manage to convince yourself, you know, I'm okay, I'm all right, I'm all right. Meanwhile, these things are going through these transformations, geometric, mathematical transformations, and they sing. They sing. And they sing objects into existence. Objects which are like made of what looks like gold, ivory, chalcedony, smaragdine, jasper, silver, diamond, but not stable objects, not objects which hold a single complex form, but objects which are constantly morphing and changing. These things are like jewels or toys or scientific instruments or something. And these things are literally dancing in your face and saying, look at this, look at this. And they're pulling each other away, one pulling another away and saying, not him, me, look at this, look at this. And as you direct your attention into these things, you have the overwhelming impression, incontrovertible impression, this is impossible. This is impossible. If I could bring one of these objects back to my world, just one, all you would have to do is show it to people, and you wouldn't have to say a word. They would know that time and space, reality and matter, spirit and energy had all been transcended into some translinguistic domain where mind and imagination are able to fabricate themselves instantly into objects. And they're doing this with language, these creatures. And what they are saying is, do this. Don't be amazed. Quench your astonishment. Do what we are doing. Do it, and do it now. And it's like you can't conceive of it. I mean, you just stammer, basically. But then there is a kind of, and now I'm speaking from my own experience, a kind of bubble in your stomach, a kind of heat, a kind of light, chakric maybe, who knows, why bother? Anyway, it's there, and it begins to move up your body. It doesn't feel like it moves up your spine. It feels to me like it moves up your esophagus. And when it gets to your mouth opens, and this linguistic activity pours out of you, a glossolalia of some sort that is spontaneous, not under the control of the ego, and that which causes objects to begin to condense out of the air like tears of mercury, like drops of ruby. And as you experiment with it, you realize, I'm doing this. My voice is making things come into existence. And these little elf machines are just hysterical with delight. I mean, they literally turn handsprings and somersaults at this point. And you're there going, ni di jing wa wa si bi bi ni jing wa ti ni fi ka pi hi oi be jing wa wa ka ti bu ki ti 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 ni fo. And this is colors, light, faceted, metallic, crystalline, silken, watery, gelatinous stuff pouring into space and contorting itself around you. And just as you're beginning to come to terms with this, the entire state folds up on itself like a paper box folding up on itself. And it's as though it telescopes away from you. It retreats. And I've even had trips where the elf machines turn and say, "Deja vu, deja vu." A bizarre farewell, I maintain. And then you're back with your grimy friends in that room. And you open your eyes, and you are about as high as 1,000 mics of acid would put you. But you proclaim immediately and with great conviction, "I'm down, I'm back." I mean, the fact that your friends all look like praying mantises is a minor detail at that point, because where you've been was so much more peculiar than where you are that you're willing to embrace it as totally ordinary reality. No problem. Just, triangular faces, compound eyes, we can relate to this. And then within 5 to 10 minutes, you completely return to the baseline of consciousness. So completely that you cannot tell that you've taken a substance. You can search into your body. No headache, no tiredness, no stimulation, no excitement. You are 100% back to where you were before you started. Now that's an extraordinary argument for the non-toxicity of DMT. Let's talk pharmacology for a minute. The way you evaluate the toxic nature of a substance is to ask yourself the question, how long can I feel it? If you take a drug, we don't even have to name the drug, if you take a drug and 36 hours later, you're still refusing phone calls and lying around in warm baths and scheduling massages, then you took a drug that was toxic. Your body didn't know what to do with it. And it took it a long time to get together a strategy for shunting it to the urinary tract or wherever it's going. A DMT is like hurling an ice cube into a blast furnace. It barely has a chance to exist before the body says, I know, I recognize this. I can deanimate this. I can dealkylate this. I can shunt this to the urine. No problem. That is a sign that this stuff is completely benign. So is the fact that it occurs ordinarily in human metabolism. Every single one of us has DMT in our brains right now as we speak. You might note that this is the ultimate catch-22 in terms of if they ever want to take us all in. They don't have to throw pot around in your apartment. Your head makes you guilty. You have a Schedule I substance in your brain. This was not known when DMT was made illegal, and it might be an interesting defense if somebody ever got into trouble. So there you have it. the most powerful hallucinogen, is the most short-acting, is the quickest to return you to the baseline of consciousness, is probably the safest, is the most widely distributed in nature. And unlike LSD or, and in some cases, psilocybin, this doesn't seem to confirm our ideas about the human unconscious, the cheerful theories of Freud, Jung, and Reich. It seems instead to imply that the universe is a system of condensed levels of manifestation that we can, under extraordinary situations, move between these levels. Science has spent the last 1,000 years convincing us that the world of physical appearances is all there is. 25 seconds into a DMT trip, and that cheerful notion has been blown to smithereens. And yet people have argued over that for thousands and thousands of years. And there it is, you know, the entities of mythology, fairyland, and dream. So I think, when I think about the psychedelic experience, I think about it as a series of concentric circles. You could think of it as a bullseye, with minor psychedelics on the rim, and then LSD, I suppose. I mean, the orders are not hard and fast. It's the concept that's important. But LSD, and then mescaline, and then psilocybin, and then DMT at the center. And if you take huge doses of mushrooms, you can get to places through breath control and sitting in darkness and doing pranayama. You can get to places where you look around and say, my God, it looks like a DMT flash. Yes, but it took you an hour and a half of hard slugging to get there. Where with the DMT, you know, it's irrevocable, it's unstoppable. There is no hanging on, no resistance. Yes, over here.
A lot of times in Brazil, and it sounds like ayahuasca has some similarities. Ayahuasca similar to DMT, or what would you say about that?
Yes, ayahuasca runs on DMT. What you see, here's the deal. DMT taken orally is destroyed in the intestine by an enzyme system called monoamine oxidase. It's simply the system which oxidizes monoamines, and all these drugs we're talking about are monoamines. What's happening with ayahuasca is there are chemicals in nature known as monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And if you mix DMT with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, then the DMT will not be destroyed in the gut. It will survive the gut, and it will pass into the bloodstream and eventually into the brain. So ayahuasca is a combination of DMT from one plant with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor from another plant that then creates a prolonged, orally accessed DMT trip. And it is certainly true that if the ayahuasca is brewed with sufficient DMT, it can be as intense as a DMT flash.
Is that the rarity of the chacruna?
The chacruna is Psychotria viridis, and that contains the DMT. The monoamine oxidase inhibitor is provided by the other plant, which is Banisteriopsis caapi, the big woody vine. I understand a lot of people are growing that vine here on Maui. That's fine. It's a fine vine, but or a fine line, I'm not sure. But what you need is the Psychotria viridis as well. So the people who are growing Banisteriopsis caapi should know that until they have a supply of Psychotria viridis, they won't be able to make good ayahuasca. However, let me say something, because this leads into it. I was just at this conference in Mexico on psychoactive plants, and the excitement there, and it's been happening at a number of these conferences recently, is people are becoming very interested in what are called ayahuasca analogs. What this means is that in most environments on this planet, there are plants which contain DMT, and there are plants which contain MAO inhibitors. And if you are of an experimentalist bent, you can create out of local plants a chemical equivalent to ayahuasca. And in some cases, these local sources of DMT and monoamine oxidase inhibitor are actually more concentrated than the Amazonian plants. So, for instance, I know of one book being written that will be called Ayahuasca Analogs, and that will contain dozens of these recipes. And I think this is going to change the tenor of the psychedelic debate considerably, because what we're going to show is that there are dozens, perhaps hundreds of plants on this planet that can be combined with other plants to create very powerful hallucinogens. And attempting to legislate and control all of this is just a fool's task, and it should be left alone. As an example, if any of you want to fiddle with this, the standard source of the MAO inhibitor is Pagamen harmala seeds. Pagamen harmala is Syrian rue. It grows from Manchuria to China in dry areas. And the 2 grams of Pagamen harmala seeds ground in a Braun coffee grinder or austerizer or something like that can be combined with some source of DMT to produce an ayahuasca analog. And you can get Pagamen harmala from seed companies, from Of the Jungle, which I mentioned, or at Iranian markets. It's a standard item in Iranian markets. It's called hurmal, H-U-R-M-A-L, and if you ask for this, they'll sell you a bag of hard little black seeds. That's Pagamen harmala. Excellent source of monoamine oxidase inhibition for the home experimenter. Yes, over here, somebody.
Yeah. Have you or known anyone that took too much DMT, I mean, twice, 3 times?
Yes, well, I remember one incident years ago where we were in the loft of some house somewhere and doing some foreign country where it was legal, and somebody who had walked like half a mile and then run up 3 flights of stairs came into the room and saw that we were smoking DMT. And so since smoking DMT takes a certain amount of courage if you have done it before, you have to sort of be macho to get through it. So this person just flopped down on the floor, huffing and puffing, and I said, Tom, you need a hit. And he took it, and he took 3 very large hits, and he was quiet for a very long time, and then in a very small voice said, "I've done too much." We just threw a blanket over him and waited. I'm pretty confident that that it's not dangerous. Somebody said that the only way DMT can be dangerous is if you fear death by astonishment. And that's a big leap sitting here, but death by astonishment is a real possibility. I mean, it is so amazing that you feel like you have broken the amazement reflex, and it's just gotten stuck. And you're saying, how awesome can something be? How blown can your mind be? Yeah.
I'm wondering, not necessarily about the physical danger, more the experience of it. Is it more in that room than you were ever, or longer lasting, or different?
It's more in it. Like, for instance, on psilocybin, you hear a teaching voice, the mushroom voice. And sometimes, this is me, I don't know if other people do this, but I've noticed in psilocybin there's a certain place, about an hour and 30 minutes into it, which I call Elfland. And it's not that there are elves there, it's that when you pass through this place, if you have had enough experience with these things, when you pass through this certain place in the psilocybin intoxication, you know that elves could be there. You can feel them the way you feel pigs in the woods, but you can't see them, you know. So when I pass through that place, I can call them out. And it's sort of like a Nepali marching band, you know. It comes from a long way off. It's like tinkling, drumming, percussive, and it comes closer and closer and closer. It's like the approach of a parade. First you hear it, then you see it, then it's all around you, then it passes by, and then you're left in darkness again. So it's a kind of coming out, and people say, you know, how do you call elves? It's very simple. Some of you may remember a wonderful episode, an early episode of I Love Lucy, where she's talking to Ethel about communicating with flying saucers. And Ethel says, well, how do you do it? She says, well, it's very simple. You just close your eyes and say, come in, little green men, come in, little green men. And I found that perfectly effective. You don't have to go to Sanskrit. You don't have to decode Kabbalistic ultrastructure. You just say, come in, little green man, and they will emerge, literally out of the woodwork. I mean, that expression, coming out of the woodwork, means a lot more to you after you smoke the DMT, because they come out of the woodwork, yes. Back here, yeah, here.
It occurred to me after experiencing DMT that if possibly there would be a correlation between near-death experiences and alien abduction experiences. Have you put any thought into that, or do you think people are kind of breaking through into that area without the...
Well, that's an interesting question. I've thought about it. The near-death experience, as conveyed by the various books, Ken Ring's books and Moody's books, sounds a lot more pedestrian than DMT flashes. I mean, it's all about beckoning dearly departed ones. I've thought about DMT in terms of that, and I think it may be an ecology of souls, but it's not Aunt Minnie or Uncle Fred. It doesn't work like that. I don't know. The near-death experience, the alien abduction thing, I have more trouble with. I know some of the people at the center of that point of view, I guess you would call them, and I haven't been terribly impressed with their integrity or their integrity. Without raining on anybody's parade, I would like to suggest that what the alien abduction experience is that we are in such a state of crisis as a culture that a lot of people are losing the ability to distinguish memory from dream. And that, in fact, it's very hard to distinguish memory from dream. We all deal with this on a trivial level. I mean, I'm sure you've had the experience of going to dinner with someone that you rarely see and saying to them, my goodness, it's been 8 years, it's been 10 years since we had dinner in this restaurant together. And them saying, hey, I've got news for you. We've never had dinner together in this restaurant. Well, in a trivial case like that, you just say, huh, that's funny. I must have dreamed it or something, because I have a very clear impression of this. But if it's an alien abduction, then it becomes much more problematic to know where to locate it. I am very resistant to, what you have to know about me is just because you're a nut, it doesn't mean that you're open to other nuts. I don't like the paranoid and menacing aura that surrounds the alien abduction thing. And as I say, the personalities in the UFO cults are squirrely without a doubt. I mean, these are not people that you would enjoy spending time with. I've seen UFOs, so I don't feel like I'm excluded from talking about it. But they always make it too simple, the witnesses. And the whole problem with the occult generally is that it's all too simple, and people claim too much knowledge. You know, people say, well, on the 11th level, the princes of the 5th chakra are involved in working with the violet energy of the this. How the hell can anybody say this kind of stuff? I mean, it's just theosophical baffle garb. The whole point is that you don't know exactly what's going on. The thing I like about psychedelics is that if you're not on them, weird shit isn't happening. I mean, I don't want to go into a boundaryless world where I'm channeling this and channeling that and manifesting something else. People say, can't you achieve these states on the natch? Well, yeah, you can if you're crazy as a shithouse owl, but who would want to, you know? I mean, the whole point is that these states are not invading ordinary consciousness. I mean, if I woke up some morning and discovered in my morning meditation that I could trigger a DMT flash, I'd get professional help well before breakfast, you may be sure. The goal is not to access these places on the natch. I mean, that's nuts. It's like trying to fly by flapping your arms. They're just as real when you access them on DMT as when you access them any other way. I don't know what it is with the... my rule, which is Occam's razor, familiar to any of you who studied logic, is hypotheses should not be multiplied without necessity. In other words, don't be weirder than you have to be based on what you know and experience, because that's weird enough if you're doing your homework. So to decide that you're going to believe in some fantastic occult cosmology is to essentially throw away your freedom. I'm a pragmatist. I don't like ideology, any ideology. I mean, I don't like, I mean, there are obviously toxic ideologies, fascism, sexism, but ideology itself is toxic. Once I asked the mushroom in the Amazon, I said, why are you dumping all this stuff on me? Why me? And it said without hesitation, because you don't believe in anything. And that's what it requires, I think, is an empty vessel. If you carry to it beliefs about fairyland or divas or etheric bodies or all that, then it will simply inflate your pre-existing belief and confirm all your prejudices, and you'll be no better off than some other form of middle-class smugness. What you have to do is try and empty yourself of belief and say to it, be what you are for yourself. And when you do that, you know, with the mushroom, there's an enormous organ tone, and black drape curtains begin to rise. And after about 45 seconds of that, you say, that's enough of what you are in and of yourself. Let's go back to the dancing mice, the little rolling candies, trees and the bright colors, please. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about, you speak of the mushroom in several of your books as the precursor for religion and brain expansion, and also I'm interested in the teleological implications here, but also as the resider at the end of time that you talk about in I think 2012, and the magnet effect. Could you go into this in a little more depth?
Yeah, I have to give a product warning here. You get two things from me. You get what you could have gotten somewhere else if you went to libraries or read books or did something. In other words, I'm just a teacher, and I tell you what you could find out somewhere else. And that's what we've been talking about here, exotic as it may seem. The other thing you get is my conclusions about these places. And those are simply my conclusions. They have no force. There's no moral or intellectual imperative to line up with me on these things. But as a psychedelic voyager, I keep trying to create a meta-theory. I keep trying to understand what is happening. And I really have come to believe, this harks back to what I was saying at the beginning here this morning about how the psychedelic experience is an experience of higher dimensionality, that what that boils down to is an awareness of the future. And the future is not what we think it is. The future is not something which extends endlessly away from this moment into a dimension that has not occurred yet. The future is finite. And this is a big surprise. I talked a little bit last night, we all operate under the scientific myth of the Big Bang, which says that the universe sprang from nothing in a single instant. That seems to me highly improbable. Difficult to assess the odds, I grant you, since it only happened once, but highly improbable that out of a perfect dimensionless vacuum, a singularity of such complexity as this universe could spring into being. If we're being logical, it seems to me that if you need a singularity to anchor your cosmology, it's much more logical to place the singularity not at the beginning of the universe, but at the end of the universe, and to see process not as the unfolding of the consequence of cause and effect following cause, but to see the universe as a process being drawn toward something, being drawn toward higher states of order, being drawn toward completion, complexity, concrescence. And this is what we in fact see. I talked about it last night, the way molecular complexity was the foundation for life, life the foundation for higher animals the foundation for thinking civilized beings, and so forth. I really believe that what's happening on this planet is a kind of birthing process. Biology is the placenta of spirit, and the entire earth is pregnant with the gestation of spirit. And it is perhaps even willing to rupture itself in order to bring to birth this higher form of organization. And in the same way that the process of the gestation and birth of a child takes a long time, but it's very dramatic in the last few hours. That's where the action is, because that's when the child moves into the birth canal, and convulsive tremoring begins, and the uterus expels the child into another dimension. I think history is the birth canal of spiritual transformation. That the reason we are such strange creatures is because we are neither spirit nor simply animal. We are the fetal form of a new ontological order. And it takes about 25,000 years for the process to come to completion. And it starts with just a seed, the building of a fire, the enunciating of a word, the forming of a thought beneath the beetled brow of some distant ancestor who raises their face from feeding for a moment and has this descent of higher order into their sphere of cognition. But once the hook is in, it begins to build. Technologies, languages, philosophical points of view, inventions, migrations, gene swarming, religious teachers, techniques, it all begins to feed into itself faster and faster and faster and faster. And now we have reached the short turns of the spiral. We are being shaped by a transdimensional intellect of some sort that lies ahead of us in the future, that casts an enormous shadow across the lower dimensions of space and time that we inhabit. And in our more primitive cultural forms, we just call it God and say, we are being propelled toward God. We are being pulled into God nature. I don't think that this is the God who, in Milton's phrase, hung the stars like lamps in heaven. I can't conceive that it could be that God. I think it's the God of biology. That biology is in the process of transforming itself on this planet, and that history represents the final crisis. And look where we are. I mean, imagine the life of the fetus in the womb. Comfortable, weightless. Food is being delivered through the umbilical cord. All needs are being met. There is simply the great oceanic oneness of being, and then growth and growth. In the same way that we expanded across continents and began to clear forests and build stone cities and build observatories, growth, growth, growth. Finally, it's all used up. The uterus, the womb is filled. It's no longer this dimension of endless freedom. Instead, it's a tiny, cramped, constricted space. The walls are closing in. This is where we are. The walls are closing in. There's no more space, and there's no going back. You probably all know the Grateful Dead song about you can't go back and you can't stand still. If the thunder don't get you, then the lightning will. That's where we are. That's what the 20th century is. It's the awareness that we have eliminated the option of centuries of a human future. It's all now going to be settled in the next few decades, whether or not this species goes extinct or goes hyperspatial. In other words, whether or not this experiment in the birthing of spirit is to end in stillbirth or a successful parting of mother and child, the earth emptying its womb, heaving an enormous sigh of relief, and us then going off to whatever grand and glorious destiny the spiritual imagination can find for itself in hyperspace. And so the chaos of the 20th century is the chaos of birth. I mean, if you had never seen a human birth and you were to happily come around the corner and be confronted with this, it vibrates medical emergency. Blood is being shed, organs are distended, there's moaning and groaning. It looks like a problem. You have to really make a leap to faith to say, how beautiful, new life coming into the world. This is how we do it. Make way for the new order. Well, that's what we have. We've used up 3D. We have begun the long path down the birth canal. We are suffocating. The walls are closing in. We cannot imagine what lies beyond us. On the other hand, a fetus in the birth canal, how can it ever know that it'll grow up to be airline pilot, research scientist, fashion model, or whatever? Those are whole realms of categories that don't even exist in the world that it inhabits. And I think that what psychedelics are about, and what shamanism is about, is getting behind the screens and learning what the plot is, figuring out what human destiny means. I don't think we should despair. I think we're moving on. Everything you know is going to be changed and lost. This is the psychedelic truth of life. Nothing lasts. Not your enemies, not your lovers, not your fortune, not even your own dear self. Nothing lasts. So the place to be is in the felt experience of the moment with a model of the whole that feeds optimism and light back into your daily activity. It's an incredible act of hubris to believe that we are not part of nature's plan, to believe that we have somehow escaped from the yoke of natural obligation and are just off on our own bender of some sort. I don't think that's true. Granted, we are weird. We are the weirdest animal species on this planet. But octopi are weird, and praying mantises are weird, and sperm whales are weird. We just claim a certain domain. We are the trigger species. We are the minded ones. We are the species that downloads ideas into matter. We are the species that lives inside history. We live inside our ideas. We fabricate cities and international airports and national governments and languages and religions, and then we inhabit these things. The soft monkey meat that we are is not the essence of our humanness. This vast coral reef of technology and information transfer devices and paved highways and all this, this is the human world that we have created. We have downloaded ideas into three-dimensional space, and we've discovered that three-dimensional space can only take so much of this downloading of structure out of the imagination and into the world. And I think now we're going to the place where the ideas come from. And the shamans, for 100,000 years, have looked out over the landscape of time and seen history and seen that it comes to an edge. And beyond that steep edge beat the oceans of transdimensional eternity. And we are now being swept toward that. We cannot remain in the womb forever. It's inconceivable that we could try to manage human society on this planet for another 1,000 years. We have raised expectations in people that cannot be met if we extract every drop of petroleum from the planet, if we fabricate all the metals into junk. We still cannot give everybody a middle-class lifestyle. So something else is happening. We are preparing for a leap into hyperspace. You know, the French have an expression which means to step back before you leap. This is what the 20th century is. The world of the Edwardian gentlemen, the mathematical dominators, the print heads, the object fetishists, all that, that's the 19th and early 20th century. Since about 1925 on, we have been circling around the problem of hyperspace, the unconscious, the Jungian archetypes, the psychedelic experience, the unspeakable. It has many names, but we have been butting our heads against it and gathering ourselves. There was an attempt in the 60s. It was premature. It's like one of those contractions where you say, it's coming, the baby's coming, it's coming, and then it doesn't come because the contractions fade away, and it turns out, no, maybe the next set of contractions will bring the baby. And that's where we are now. And we need to learn from the 60s and from the past. But I think psychedelics are central to our cultural evolution, and I think that's obvious because mind is central to our cultural evolution. If the expansion of consciousness is not what the future is about, well then what kind of future is it going to be? Is it going to be a progressively more brutish, regimented, fascist, mechanistic, organized and totalitarian future? I fear so, if we don't honor the mind, celebrate diversity and complexity, and psychedelicize ourselves in an attempt to do it as your question implied and I responded. You can predose with the MAO inhibitor and then take the tryptamine. What we developed in the Amazon that we really enjoyed doing was taking mushrooms, and about 2 hours into the mushroom trip, smoking the bark of Banisteriopsis caapi, smoking the bark of the ayahuasca plant. Well, that contains an MAO inhibitor. And if you just took a couple of drags of this MAO inhibitor with your system saturated with psilocybin, it would immediately dial up the brightness of the hallucinations, and for about 25 minutes. And then it would go back to the normal level, and then you could take another hit and do it again. And you could do this 5 or 6 times in the course of a night. We called it vegetable television. And it was wonderful because the hallucinations were very colorful, 3-dimensional, highly engaging, but not overwhelming, you know. I mean, there are 2 kinds of hallucinations, at least. I mean, there are more than 2, but I want to distinguish 2. There's hallucinations that you look at, and there are hallucinations that you become. And one turns into the other. You know, if you take a high dose of psilocybin or ayahuasca or DMT, first you see the hallucinations, and then you become them. I think this thing I described on Salvia Divinorum, where I said I was not only seeing weird stuff, but it was coming up behind me and beginning to mess with my mind, that's the beginning of the hallucinations leaving the realm of something you look at and actually turning you into a hallucination. Yeah.
The hallucinations are a very visual thing, and that's how we explain them. I'm wondering if you've ever had the experience of doing DMT or any other hallucinogen with a person who's been blind from birth, and how they would describe that.
No, this question was asked last night to people blind from birth. It would be an interesting experiment to do, because what it would tell you is whether the hallucinations are generated in the optical pathway or in the deeper brain. I suspect they're in the deeper brain. Yeah. Over here. Yeah.
Do you think that the regurgitation and vomiting that comes with ayahuasca actually has a positive effect on, in my way of thinking, I think it's like clearing out old clogged circuits of circuitry?
Yeah, it's a purgative. I mean, the great thing about ayahuasca is that it addresses the whole body, not just the mind. And it does clean you out. And it makes it easier to take ayahuasca in the future then, because usually the first trip is the roughest in terms of the vomiting. The vomiting is caused by the harmine, which is an emetic at the MAO inhibiting level. Not everybody vomits, but in Peru they place a cultural value on the vomiting, and so they always try to vomit. Yeah.
You make frequent references to phenomena existing in hyperspace. Could you differentiate hyperspace from cyberspace?
Well, cyberspace is the attempt to create hyperspace through technology, through virtual reality or through computer networking or something like that. On one level, culturally, what we're doing is we're hardwiring the human unconscious. Much of the world is now under the control of machines. The world price of gold is set each day by computers that make calculations based on many, many parameters that are being measured. Interest rates and the rate of the production of raw materials. Many things are under the control of machines. And machines are psychedelic. I mean, I'm not an anti-technologist. I think drugs are becoming more like computers. Computers are becoming more like drugs. If the materialist pharmacologists are correct, then it should be possible to design a drug which causes you to whistle the first 10 bars of Dixie, and that's all. In other words, if thoughts can be molecularly specified, then it should be possible to design drugs which are like newspapers and tell you what happened in the world in the last 24 hours. Now, we may be a long way from that, but that's the end goal of reductionist pharmacology. Yeah.
You mentioned a space on psilocybin where you could call in this L10. Is there other signposts along the way, like a matrix or a feeling of interconnectedness that you can steer your way through after having been there many times before? Are there a lot of recognizable directions and forks in the road that you tend to want to follow, or others you want to stay away from?
Well, it's a topology. I mean, it's a shifting topology. I can only speak for myself. I'll tell you how I do mushrooms. I do them on an empty stomach. I don't eat for 6 hours. I don't call that fasting. I just call that emptying your stomach. I take them on an empty stomach. I take 5 dried grams. I weigh 145 pounds. If you weigh more, take more. If you weigh less, take less. I take the mushrooms and then I sit. Even though, for me, they never come on faster than an hour. I sit that whole hour. And I usually smoke a bomber. And I usually roll up 3 more. And then I have them laying in front of me. And then at about the hour and 20-minute mark, well, in the first hour, there are certain presentational symptoms, but they're trivial. Your nose runs. The psilocybin is causing that. That's real. That's a symptom. Your nose runs. Sometimes you have to go to the bathroom. Get all this taken care of in the first 45 minutes. Then sit there. Then for me, at about the hour and 20-minute mark, give or take, not more than 5 minutes, it begins what's called streaming. Streaming is when you close your eyes and there are after-image colored globs of stuff floating by, either colored mauve or chartreuse. It's pretty trivial. But you just watch. And part of what you have to train people to do is, it's weird, people don't know how to look at the back of their own eyelids. People don't know how to look at darkness. And so what I say is close your eyes, sit in darkness, and watch the back of your eyelids with the simple expectation that you might see something. You know, close your eyes and look. Well, then the streaming gives way to the first wave, which is usually pretty steep. I mean, I've had trips where I could see it coming toward me, you know, and it was 100 miles wide and 10 miles high, and it's just like a tidal wave, and you say, oh my God, you know, what have we done here? Raise this thing up, and it's just roaring toward you, and there's nothing you can do then, except I just say to it, you know, I'm yours, please don't hurt me. Please, for Christ's sake, don't hurt me. And it's like watching a thermonuclear explosion through about 30 feet of crystal clear glass. I mean, when I do it in California, I have the feeling that when the thing hits, everybody from Vancouver to Tijuana must have just had to crawl under their desk, because the idea that this is in your mind is inconceivable. I mean, it hits with the force of an asteroid impact or something like that. And then, you know, have you ever seen these things where when they set off an atom bomb, 500 meters from ground zero, they set up cameras, and then 1,000 meters, and then 1,500 meters. And as the explosion takes place, the first set of cameras gets a second and a half, and then they're vaporized, and the switches move back 500 meters to the next set of cameras. You get 3 seconds of film, and then those cameras are vaporized. Well, that's what it's like. It just keeps exploding the perceptor, and finally, you know, in a sense, you lose consciousness because you can't say what goes on. It's just so extraordinarily boundary dissolving that there's no there, and there's no you there to tell you about it. And then you begin to drift down through the layers, and it presents itself. And it can present itself all kinds of different ways. I remember one trip I had, I think it was this same trip, the 100 miles wide, 10 miles high thing. This wave came at me, and I barely had time to lay down. And after a long, long time, I became aware that there was a woman standing over me in some kind of tight-fitting suit, some kind of sexy outfit, and I heard a voice, and it said, "They say it helps to close your eyes, cowboy." And so I closed my eyes, and it was just raging. And then after about 30 seconds, I opened my eyes, and this woman who was standing over me with my body between her legs put her face right down next to mine and said, "Is it strong enough for you, asshole?" And I said, "Yes, it's strong." So, you know, the humor of the thing is amazing. It can come at you so many different ways. And then the conversations take place. And they can be anything. I mean, I remember one trip where, you know, something's happening and then click, and I'm looking at a map, and over here is the East Coast, New England, Florida, so forth, and over here is Europe and England. And so I'm looking at this map, and then I see a little ship setting off from France, like a little cartoon ship. And the voice says in my head, "Each ship represents 10,000 settlers." And so I see this ship go across, and it lands in New England. And then I see one leave from England, and it lands in Georgia. And then I see little villages growing. It says, "Each village represents a community of 100,000 people." Well, what is this? It's an animated movie about the colonization of North America? Great, thank you. I have no idea what this is for. The other thing you can do with mushrooms, which is really fun, is you can say to it, "Be MDMA," and it will just drop its outer space-ish garb and all that, and it will be MDMA. You can say to it, "Be LSD," and it will be LSD. And then, as I said, the scariest thing to say to it is, "Show me what you really are for yourself." And at that point, it just begins to come apart, and you can't stand it. After 40 seconds of that, you say, "I'm sorry I even asked. You know, reassure me." And because you have the sense, you know, my God, this thing is what it seems to be. It's a galactic intelligence. It's 1 billion years old. It's touched 10 million worlds. It knows the history of 150,000 civilizations. It's beyond your possibility of conceiving, and why it is communicating with an organic atom like yourself is not entirely clear. Its essence cannot be assimilated. It guards you from it. It protects you. And one thing I've always noticed about mushrooms is how incredibly kind it is to beginners. You know, people almost never have bad trips early on in their involvement with it. It's once you trust it and it trusts you, then it says, you know, how far do you want to go? How far do you want to go? And this is a real, here on a place like Maui, where there's a lot of spiritual disciplining going on and a lot of stress on conscious growth, it's worth talking about this. I have the impression from psilocybin that if you truly want to be the monk on Cold Mountain, this is the way to do it. You can do it. With all these other spiritual disciplines, yoga, diet, mantrayana, the whole bit, everybody drives with the accelerator slammed to the floor. That's the only way to make progress in those disciplines, is work at it like a dog, and maybe you'll get somewhere. Once you come to psychedelics, you get a lot of interest in locating the brake pedal. The brake pedal becomes central to the enterprise. It's no more about how can I move faster toward my spiritual goals. It's all about how can I prolong this so that it lasts a lifetime before I become incomprehensible to everybody who knows me. And if you wish that, if you truly feel drawn to sagehood, then all you have to do is take mushrooms a lot. You know, I take them every few months. Some people take them every few weeks. Take it 3 times in a week at the 5-gram dose, and you will have to make decisions about what you want to do with your life. Because I've noticed when I take it in the Amazon, the perception that you really have to discipline yourself to resist is the mushroom says, you know, go into the forest. Take off your clothes. You can survive in the forest. You don't need civilization. And I don't know whether it's true or not. I mean, there are horrible, horrible stories of people who were found raving mad 5 days later, driven so by the bite of insects. But on the other hand, you know, the jungle is where we came out of, and you do have the feeling that you really want to go back to the canopy, that you really want to be in the canopy, eating fruit and picking fleas off your mate and enjoying the sunshine. Yeah.
Well, quite often when I take mushrooms, I access an insect world. And also they are little marching bands, and just like you talk about the elves. Have you ever encountered that?
Sure.
The same way? They're lots of fun and the same kind of context.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's small, fun, marching and performing entities of some sort. I've thought a lot about DMT and tried to create a model for it. And I've created many models, and all of them taken together don't do it justice. And I realize that every time I smoke DMT. The first thing I realize is everything you've been telling people is bullshit. That's not what it is at all. And so here comes some. As I grok it, the archetype of DMT is the archetype of the circus. And here's why. The circus is about clowns. It's about a circle of light. It's about a dome, a tent. And under the big tent and in the circle of light, the clowns perform. And a circus is a wonderful place to bring children. But a circus is more than clowns under the big tent. My own first awareness of eros that I have is we are changing the tape.
Is that Eros?
The first awareness of eros that I can remember for myself was when I was about 3. My parents took me to a circus, and there, high above the center ring, hanging by her teeth in a tiny spangled costume, was the acrobat lady. And this is death and eros spun together. She's practically naked. She's hanging by her teeth. She works without nets, and I got it. You know, I didn't have an atom of testosterone in my body at age 3, but I got it. That's part of the DMT thing. Eros, in some way that I have not been able to put my hand on. I recently saw somebody, I've seen a lot of people do DMT, but I saw someone do DMT who had a full body orgasm, and it went on and on and on and on, and this woman kept saying, take me, take me, take me. And then she was saying, I want to stay here with you. I want to stay here with you. And, you know, she had never had an experience like this. So there is this erotic component. But the circus is more than the acrobat lady and the clowns. It's also the sideshows. The thing in the bottle, the goat-faced boy, and the fat lady, and all of that. And that's there too, the weirdness of it all. I remember I grew up in a small Colorado town, and every 4th of July, the carnival would come. And we, the children of the town, would look forward to this. And then when the carnival came, our mothers would not let us play outside as late at night as we used to be able to, because carny people are strange, you know. You don't know where they came from. They probably don't have the same morals and ethics as the townsfolk. They entertain us all for a few days, and then they pack up all their stuff and go away, and it's like they were never there. And every kid worth his or her salt wants to run away with the circus. So I really think the circus is one fitting metaphor for what DMT is. There are other metaphors. I mean, when I go in there and treat with those elves, I have the feeling that they love me, they're fun, we're having a good time, but you don't want to take your eye off the ball. This is no place to let down. And I've asked myself, where in the past have I had this strange feeling, this mixture of friendliness but possible risk, cooperative dealing with danger in the background? And I recall in the mad folly of my youth, I used to smuggle gold from Laos to India. And I would take this gold, these gold bars, kilo gold bars. It was when gold was much cheaper, I should say, and I could afford kilo gold bars. Strapped to my body, I would go to the Crawford Market of Bombay and buy hash for whatever purpose. And going to the Crawford Market and dealing with these Muslim hash dealers, you know, you're my friend, come in. I had the same feeling that I had with the DMT. It's, we're your friends. He said, I am your friend. I'm not like all the others. Great, Ahmed. I'm glad you're not like all the others. They're mean traders, is what these things are. They want you to give them a meme. Do you know what a meme is? A meme is the smallest unit of an idea. In the same way that we are made of genes, ideas are made of memes. A meme is like, Anti-Semitism is a meme.
So,
M-E-M-E. Communism is a meme. The bikini is a meme. A meme is an idea, or the smallest unit of an idea. These guys are meme traders. And what they want is ideas, human ideas. They collect them the way you might collect a carved mask if you went to the Sepik River region of New Guinea or something. And what they trade are trade goods. These things they were showing me. The look at this, look at this. Those are the equivalent of combs, barrettes, baubles, and small mirrors. The kind of stuff I take to the Amazon to give to the Indians. You're saying, wouldn't you like this? Give us a line of poetry. Or how about a mathematical equation? Or something like this. They are traders in memes. They are also, again, trying to be logical. If you accept that they exist, these entities, then it raises certain fairly profound questions. Where are they? Who are they? And what do they want? If you accept that these are real entities, real beings, well, trying to be logical about it, it seems to me there are a fairly limited number of choices. They are extraterrestrials of the classic, we have been studying you for 50,000 years, we have come to correct the gravitational, that kind of extraterrestrial, extraterrestrial, evolved around another star and came here by some technology. They are either extraterrestrials or they are time travelers from some future so distant that this is what human beings have become, things made out of light that look like self-dribbling basketballs, which means they must be at least 50 years in the future. So they're either extraterrestrials, they're either from a human future, or, next possibility, they are from another continuum. In other words, they didn't come from a distant star. They came from another energy world somewhere that is, in practical terms, nearby. But we have no evidence that such things are even possible, even though science fiction is filled with so-called parallel continui. We don't know whether this is even a viable concept. Or, and this, believe it or not, is the most conservative possibility. If we accept that these things exist, if we accept that they have an intent to communicate with us and can in fact communicate with us, if we accept that they have a deep interest and affection for humanity, then it seems to me the most logical and conservative position would be these are human souls. These are human beings, either in a post-mortem or prenatal existence of some sort. This, I never would have thought that I would be pushed to this. But I took DMT to the Amazon years ago and gave it to ayahuasqueros that I respected. And they just say, well, you haven't been listening. Didn't we tell Evergreen that at the end of the most technological and reductionist and materialist of all cultural binges, we would discover a way to look over the barrier of death itself and see the survival of organic existence in another dimension. That is just about the most astonishing development that this culture could endure. Far more astonishing than having visitors from Zenebel Ganubi land at UN Plaza and start handing out technological gimmicks. And yet, this is what shamans have always believed for 100,000 years. This is the generally accepted belief about these entities. It just doesn't happen to be generally accepted in the high-tech industrial democracies infected with the meme of science. There, this idea is outlandish. But the people who take these things in the rainforests, in the Oaxacan mountains, for them, it's perfectly obvious that this is what it is. And as I said, I was raised Catholic. I spent a huge amount of time desacralizing myself, reading Camus and Sartre and Nietzsche and Husserl and Merleau-Ponty and positivists, and dabbled in Marxism and was a hardcore materialist. But life lived honestly, meaning not denying the content of my experience, has led me to the conclusion that the scientific model of how the universe works is complete hokum. I mean, it's fine for predicting the charge of the electron or how to land an artillery shell on somebody's head, but when you talk about, what is mind, what is life, what is intelligence, science has nothing to say about this. Science is a strategy for solving simple questions. Shamanism is a strategy for solving very, very complex questions. And I think that DMT presents a science and cultural destroying frontier. In the same way that medieval Christianity could not hold itself together in the face of the discovery of the New World, meaning this hemisphere, I don't think science, as we inherited it from the Renaissance, is going to be able to survive the confrontation with the psychedelic experience. I think this is one more reason why these things are so stigmatized and forbidden and taboo, because they are the absolute confoundment of our official religion. They show that what we believe about reality is complete hokum, and that we are actually going to have to go back to the idea that there is such a thing as a soul, that there are parts of the human personality that survive physical death, and that therefore, and this is, I suppose, sobering news for everybody, life does have a dimension of moral obligation. We are not just simply free to be secular jerks. We have to try to figure out what the universe wants of us, what is acceptable behavior and what is not. In other words, there is a moral imperative in all this. Every religion of enduring quality has some notion of an after-death vehicle, that life is a strengthening of certain structures ordinarily invisible that will be very important at the moment of death to carry the personality through to another domain. And the evidence of psychedelics and shamanism, I think, is that we need to at least take this seriously and explore it. And it can be explored. It's not in principle beyond rational comprehension. It's just that it can't be approached through an instrumentality. In other words, the way scientists like to work is they like to build fancy instruments and then integrate fancy measurements into some fishy equation. That's not how this works. We have to send great-souled people with tremendous artistic and poetic skills. We have to send those people into that dimension, and they have to return and sing and dance around our campfires and teach us what is there. And if this is done, I think that along with this dimension of moral obligation that the survival of the soul implies, there is also a dimension of hope and optimism. We don't know what life is for. And it's tremendously liberating to reconnect with the idea that there is more to the end of life than the yawning grave and becoming worm food. And it's that faith, and it isn't a faith exactly, it's secured by direct experience of the shamanic domain, but it is that experience which gives life meaning. Without that experience, meaning is not intrinsic. It has to be conferred. And so you confer meaning by fetishizing objects, or by becoming fetishistic about power and control over other people. And these are the things that do not satisfy, but that we attempt to assuage our anxiety with. So I think that in terms of human psychology, the psychedelics are empowering us to discover the true nature of humanness, a fact that our obsession with scientism has occluded for us. And this is incredibly important for the culture, because frankly, I can't tell whether we're going to survive our history. It may be too late. It may be that what appears to be happening is in fact happening, and that we have wrecked the planet, and that we are destined for extinction. But it may be that death itself is somehow the answer, and that what we are headed forward into is a kind of non-physical existence in a non-physical dimension. I find that sobering. I'm not keen on it, but I'm willing to entertain it because I'm a realist. I know how far down the primrose path toward ruin we've come, and I know how hard it is to change people's minds. So maybe we're just going to continue practicing bad cultural habits until we in fact rob ourselves of any space in 3D in which we can be comfortable. Or perhaps there is a way to avoid that and to dissolve the boundaries between life and death and to become co-simultaneously both spirit and body, both in the physical three-dimensional realm and able to travel and move in these higher and hidden dimensions that the psychedelics reveal. This is what the future will unfold for us. And I think we're very close to the denouement. I believe that the acceleration of historical process that we feel all around us is part of a general law of acceleration that has been in place since the earliest moments that this universe came into existence, and that as the spiral reaches closure, we are going to be carried into a new realm of the spirit, and death and transfiguration may well turn out to be the same thing. Questions? Yes.
My interest in the last year and a half with mushrooms and DMT and you has been the exploration of whether this is the death state. It seems that ultimately it's going to be the biggest trip. When I did 5 grams, I got a message that I would have a choice to stay infinitely alive within my imagination, or the other choice was just non-judgmental, just to go to sleep. And the idea of staying awake forever in the imagination biologically had a kind of a tiring feeling to it. But just those 2 choices. I'm wondering if you, when you go into the, when you're under the influence, do you explore that question in particular? And have you gotten answers about it?
No, I do explore that question in particular. Staying alive forever in the human imagination is a very interesting concept. Imagine for a moment that anything was possible. Imagine, for example, that the laws of physics were suddenly replaced with the laws of the imagination. Well, that's a very interesting meditation, because it starts out, at least for me, I think, well, if I could have anything, what would I have? Well, what would I like to have if I could have anything? So it begins modestly. I would somehow transfer the Vatican Library to Versailles, and I would live at Versailles and have access to the Vatican Library and all other books and works of art that have ever existed, and I would walk in a garden. But then I start thinking like this, and I say, no, but the question was, what would it be like if it could be anything? Why would you want Versailles? Why would you want the Vatican Library? If you could have anything. And you realize our imagination is completely constrained by the laws of physics. What would we become if we could become anything? I mean, if I could snap my fingers and you were omnipotent, what would you do? The first thing I would do is I would fly. I would just leap about 300,000 feet in the air and give the cowboy yell. But then you would realize, the entire universe is now your bubble. You can cross the galaxy in the wink of an eye. You can journey back to the Big Bang in the time it takes to think about it. There is no civilization in the history of the cosmos, no work of art, no ecstasy, no experience that is denied you. And I maintain that we would become, within minutes of this transformation, unrecognizable to ourselves, because we are completely defined by our limitations. And so that's what I imagine death is. It's the discovery that you can be, do, see, think, and feel anything. That you have been defocused from the point in space and time where your identity intersected a knot of meat, which is your body. And that knot has now been untied, and you are flowing back into the infinite holographic ocean of all possibilities. And some people will create hell worlds. Some people want to be in nightmare worlds. And some people will create paradise upon paradise upon paradise. It's the final conquest of the imagination by free will. This is what William Blake was talking about, what he called the divine imagination. Yeah.
On language, you spoke about language as being a strong building block of this segment of history, a building and evolutionary thing. I saw you in a video, a very psychedelic video, where you used a lot of descriptive words describing this very incredible thing, and then you compressed it into, it's a bird, baby, it's a bird. And that whole thought about how compressing and confusing language is, there's a real paradox there.
Yes, language is best used to lie. That's what it's best at, because it's a kind of betrayal. It's an incredible flattening of reality. And I think the example you mentioned was, I was saying, a child lying in a nursery, in a crib, and a bird flies into the room. And for the child, this moving, fluttering thing of light and sound is a miracle that has many, many dimensions to it. But the child's mother then comes into the room and sees what's happening, and she says, "It's a bird. It's a bird, baby, bird." So what happens then is this mysterious, irreducible complex of light and motion is changed into a word. And the word is like a little tile. And that word is affixed over the bird and now covers the bird. And by the time you're 6 years old, you've been handed enough of these small tiles that everywhere you look, it's seamless tiling.